The atmosphere in the cabinet was one of frenzy and anger. The news of the fall of Fort Necessity had been a bombshell to British politics. William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, the favourite son of King George, had assembled a strong war party behind him, strengthened by years of belligerent French foreign policy. Peace-loving Prime Minister Newcastle, wanting to stave off an escalation, had stayed in contact with the French ambassador Mirepoix. In an attempt to buy time, Mirepoix wanted to negotiate a demilitarized zone in the Ohio country. For Cumberland and his supporters, however, the time for diplomacy was over. They proposed to send Cumberland's favourite general, Edward Braddock of the Coldstream Guards, with the 44th and 48th Regiments of Redcoats to America to deal with the French once and for all. Two more regular regiments were also to be formed in the colonies, the 50th and the 51st Regiments of Foot. Moreover, the government would send £120,000 in aid to Virginia to shore up its defences. General Braddock would not only be the supreme commander of all forces in North America, but also would be equipped with extensive political authority over the colonies. He would also get the right to instruct intercolonial assemblies to issue war taxes, making him the de facto viceroy in America. This would also be a radical departure from the previous laissez-faire colonial policy Britain pursued before the war. Governor Shiley of Massachusetts, well connected as he was, knew about Braddock's arrival well in advance. Him and his colleague in Nova Scotia, Charles Lawrence, would prepare a preemptive action against the French-speaking Catholic population of Nova Scotia, them being conquered by Britain in the War of Austrian Succession. Shiley also made preparations to raise troops in his own colony. On the other side, the French were beginning to understand that they too had to prepare for war. On the 3rd of January 1755, King Louis had approved of a plan to send his own troops to defend New France. 9 ships of the line would carry 4 battalions of troops to Quebec and 2 to Louisbourg, a total of 3,650 men from the great naval base at Brest. These troops were to be led by Brigadier General Discourt, a specialist in irregular warfare. The ships selected for this task had to be stripped of all their armaments in order to accommodate the troops. The squadron would be headed by Admiral Dubois de la Motte. 6 more fully armed ships of the line would accompany the flotilla to New France, headed by Admiral MacNamara, an Irish Jacobite who fled the Duke of Cumberland's reprisals after the Jacobite Rising. A dozen more warships were also being prepared to sail at Brest. Dubois de la Motte was carrying with him on his flagship a replacement for the unpopular Governor Duquesne, Lieutenant General of the fleet Vaudreuil. Born in Canada as the son of a governor, Vaudreuil had been the obvious choice for the job. He knew Canadian geography better than anyone else, and was appreciative of the abilities and aware of the shortcomings of Indian and Canadian warriors. De la Motte's transport squadron and MacNamara's small war fleet left port jointly on the 20th of May. After escorting for 600 miles, MacNamara's squadron turned around, returning to Brest. Given a week's head start, a Royal Navy squadron under Admiral Boscawen was already at the west coast of Newfoundland, ready to intercept them. As the French approached Louisbourg, however, they got scattered by a storm. With poor visibility and no concentrated French convoy to attack, Boscawen was only able to find 3 ships: the Alcide, Luce and Dauphin Royal. On the morning of June 10th, the British third-rate Dunkirk opened fire on the Alcide after her captain Richard Howe had told the French ship that Britain and France were still at peace. The Alcide and Luce, lacking any armament to defend themselves, were captured, with the Dauphin Royal escaping. The rest of the Louisbourg-bound squadron arrived safely, with Boscawen being unable to attack for a lack of orders. Thus, the Royal Navy was only able to capture 2 ships of the entire French squadron. This provided Britain with no spoils to go with her shame for attacking a nation's ships with which they were not at war. 4 months earlier, Braddock had arrived in Virginia aboard a ship of the line. He summoned all colonial governors to Alexandria and Virginia to instruct them on the upcoming campaigns, and to delegate which colony was to raise how many troops. The atmosphere at the conference was tense, as Braddock held the colonial assemblies in little regard. He instructed the governor as if they were his subordinate commanders. Many of the colonial assemblies resisted, as they wanted to protect their right to levy taxes. The only ones eager to contribute to the war were the New England colonies. William Shiley was even granted a regular army commission and tasked with supervising all northern campaigns, and to even personally lead an attack against Fort Niagara. The office of Indian Superintendent was given to New Yorker William Johnson, who had lived among the Mohawk tribe for a number of years and was fluent in many native languages. Johnson and Charlie were fierce political rivals, however they were forced to work together as Johnson was tasked with an expedition against Fort Saint-Frédéric at Lake Champlain, both his and Charlie's expedition starting from Albany. Braddock himself would lead both of his Redcoat regiments to Fort Duquesne. It is May 1755. Braddock chose to start his expedition from Wills Creek, like Washington had done the year before. The road, however, needed to be widened in order to make it possible for siege artillery to pass through. The backbreaking manual labor had to be done by his soldiers from his two regular regiments. His forces numbered 2,400, consisting of 1,300 redcoats, with the rest being militia from Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. 500 civilians, men and women alike, followed the column to fulfill tasks like washing, cooking, the laundry, or selling goods to the soldiers. Washington was also part of the expedition as a civilian. Regulations stipulated that no provincial field officer can be superior to a regular field officer, which would have demoted Washington to a captain. Thus Braddock took Washington into his private household as a civilian aide-de-camp, as he was the only one who had already fought a battle in the Ohio country. This, however, meant that Washington was not getting any pay for his service. Braddock also enlisted Irish-Pennsylvanian fur trader George Corrigan as a dolmetcher and mediator between him and the Ohio Indians. Corrigan had managed to arrange a meeting between Braddock and Tannacreson's band at Fort Cumberland. The half-king had died sometime in spring due to an illness. His successor was the Oneida chief Scaroadi. One of his followers, called Moses the Song, had brought with him a map of Fort Duquesne drawn by one of Washington's men who was taken as a hostage after the Battle of Fort Necessity. Braddock, not understanding this gesture of goodwill from the Indians, chose to disregard it altogether. He also outright rejected any alliance proposal from the Ohio Valley natives, who actually had good reasons to expel the French and their rival tribes from the north, who were allied to the French and were now swarming the Ohio country. When Scaroadi asked what would happen to the Ohio country after an English victory, Braddock replied, "The English will inhabit and inherit the land." When Scaroadi asked if the English could coexist with the Indians in the Ohio country, Braddock replied, "No savages will inherit the land." Insulted by the British general, the Indian delegation left and returned home. Braddock's massive column left Fort Cumberland at May 29th, with only 7 Mingos accompanying them as native scouts. After 1 week of painfully slow marching, Braddock grew impatient and split his troops into 2 columns. He handpicked 1,200 men, mostly redcoats, and marched ahead in a flying column. The rear column with all the artillery, militiamen and civilians would be led by Colonel Thomas Dunbar. After a while of marching, the flying column got separated 60 miles from its counterpart. When approaching the Monongahela River, the enemy Indian scouts started appearing in the woods surrounding the road. Small skirmishes erupted around Braddock's column, with the enemy Indians fleeing at the first volley when encountering the Brits. This encouraged Braddock even more to push onwards. The army forded the Monongahela River without incident southeast of Fort Duquesne. He thought that maybe the French chose to abandon the fort as indefensible. Little did he know that 900 men, 637 Indians, 146 Canadians and 108 French regulars were already on the march to intercept him. Not far from the crossing, 6 miles from the Forks, this force collided with Braddock's vanguard in a confused meeting engagement. In this shootout, a random long-range shot killed the French commander of the militia. Confused by the sudden death of their commander, the French militia retreated to Fort Duquesne. Their Indian allies, however, together with a small group of French regulars, saw no reason to retreat and dispersed into the forest. Hearing the musket shots from the vanguard, the main body of the column wanted to rush forward, colliding with the retreating vanguard. The road was now stuffed with confused redcoats in a very small space, being practically sitting ducks for the Indian sharpshooters. The redcoats fired some dispersed volleys into the woods, barely hitting anything. All the while, the French and Indian marksmen had an easy time picking off their scarlet-coated enemy. Braddock, brave as he was, rushed to his vanguard trying to organize a coherent line. Washington all the while accompanied him. During the course of the engagement, 3 horses got shot from underneath Washington and his coat and hat were pierced by multiple musket balls. This grueling slaughter continued as Braddock and Washington desperately tried to organize the men, but to no avail. After 3 hours of fighting, 2/3 of the flying column had become casualties and 60 of Braddock's 86 officers were shot. Just when the French and Indian fire started to become less intense due to the Indians starting to loot their fallen foes, a musket ball smashed into Braddock's back, knocking him off his horse. Severely wounded, he was hauled onto a cart. His men, seeing this, started to instantly panic. The jammed road became even more jammed, whereas panicking redcoats were trying to run towards safety. Ironically, this moment of panic had been the safest in the entire engagement so far, as most of the Indian sharpshooters were either out of ammunition or busy looting the British fallen soldiers and captured rum supply. In the hurried retreat, the British left behind their wounded to be scalped, looted and killed by the Indians. When they reunited with Dunbar's column, the entire force was down to 2,000 men. Dunbar, seeing Braddock's utterly defeated and demoralized force, thought there must have been a terrifyingly large French and Indian army ahead. The truth was, however, that the Indian allies of the French, after having looted so much, called it a day and returned home. French regulars were also withdrawn, leaving Fort Duquesne practically undefended. Dunbar, not knowing any of this, ordered all his heavy artillery and supplies destroyed and rushed back to Pennsylvania. When the survivors arrived, Dunbar completed the humiliation of the Redcoats by asking the city of Philadelphia for winter quarters in July. Braddock still survived in agony for a few days before finally passing away. The largely unscathed militia from Virginia was integrated into a reconstituted Virginia regiment and stationed at Fort Cumberland, shielding Virginia from native raids. The northern part of Pennsylvania's frontier, however, was completely undefended, with the Ohio Valley natives using Braddock's large, welcoming road as their warrior's path to attack the most populous and richest colony of British North America. They unleashed hell on Pennsylvania by raiding very far into the colony, triggering the biggest refugee crisis North America had ever seen up to that point.